lovely listeners. Welcome back to The Oath. I hope that you are enjoying the story so far. Today is yet another chapter of lies, betrayal, and lust, and the end. So let's begin to see where this will take us. 오늘의 날씨 일기예보는 맑음 햇살 밝은 오후 무작정 어딘가 향하는 발걸음 너와 자주 걷던 거리 어쩌면 너무 익숙해져 버린 습관과 같던 매일 너랑 기억에 갇혀 살아 Dee, my mind was running with different thoughts, and I had no idea how to stop them from clashing together. The photo that was taken on Ya's phone haunted me, and everything was now spinning out of control. Between the two men here with me, who did I trust? They were childhood friends, yet one of them murdered May like she was an animal. Looking from one to the other, I began to back away from them. Nitsalatiku, I warned. Ya's face broke into horror. Cơ xã tế của tôi mê nó, bây giờ. Cơ giờ tụi nó được shit up là hầu nè. Giờ yếu lệ gì cũng như để tao có ý dạng cậu. Chủ nà, Ray yelled. She lệ li nó, bảo chỉ tao đã chỉ lọ. Mà nó của xã tế bé chỉ tao luôn là kề, kề bé là bùi không có kề. Come with đây, I said looking at his bloody body. He nodded and walked off toward the room to gather his things. I turned to find Ya staring at me with an icy glare. Cũng chẳng chỉ tao tế có yếu lệ tao cô, he whispered. Cô xã tế cô bó cô trong chăn được tụi nó. I laughed and I stepped away from him. Bao cơ trong cha? Cô tế xã tế cô bao cơ trong cha thế à? Đó là, dạ cô trao có đà, dạ lý tôi nên tùa. Có tao tao yếu kế là nà. Dạ cô chỉ hai đến đó đâu có, giống mà tấm mừng nà. Khó chân cũng như yếu lá xuôi dạ yếu tế có một mình yếu. I blinked away terror and couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wiped my cheeks and tucked a strand behind my ear. Sẽ lý chả là mấy đứa tốt lợi. Bé tôi nó báo khả chân để dạo lý chả tìa. Cũng như trả tàu tay đồ luôn tôi hay tìa, cũng như chỉ tàu lý chả đồ nữa. Cũng tôi chỉ tàu nó là bươi của kêu một bươi thái lúc không xa ná. Cũng chính cả. Ta chỉ có bà xa để tay rầu, do nữ trao ô rừng tôi khưng mạng. Do nữ tôi tôi khưng vào nhà chỉ bỏ đá tìa khó từ nọ. Do chủ yếu mấy thứ nên tôi này sư, cũng... Before I could finish speaking, the door to the outside suddenly burst open, and I flew into Ya's arms, shaking. The wind began howling from outside, and the curtains flew like a dancing ballerina. We both walked together into the living room where the open door greeted us. The room was quiet, nothing out of sort except for the wind blowing, and then came the scratching of nails on the wall. I gasped and covered my ears with my hands. Chịu nà, mẹ, cái gì chịu kia là gì nọ, bé tôi chỉ tao tua cái nà. Ôi nhà cái là hệ, có chỉ hệ tụi này tua cái sợi, có bị hệ bé qua chị. The room went silent, and then we heard a thud coming from the room where Jay had disappeared into. Ya and I exchanged looks, and we both ran to where he was and shoved the door open. On the ground was Jay, his face black and blue, with a dark figure behind him gripping his neck. Ya took a hold of Jay's legs and pulled him toward us, only to hear a loud snap. I cried out Jay's name as we watched the dark figure before us, with Jay's head in her hands. The body began to twitch, blood oozing from the decapitated neck, and I pulled Ya way up to me. Then we watched as she slowly took Jay's head to her mouth and kissed the lips. Laughter echoed through the room, and I screamed as Ya shoved me out and slammed the door shut. Ya, I began crying. The doors and windows began opening and closing all around us, a banging orchestra that made our ears hurt. I screamed and screamed as Ya held me in his arms, and then the door where Jay's body was opened. His head rolled out, and my breath clung to my throat as a soft voice began singing. Do not let Cú bự chỉ tao trình gió za kê xì lù. and a wave of giggle exploded around the house as Ya ran for the door to open, but it remained locked. He banged his hand on the wooden frame and turned to me. A giggle echoed from the room where Jay's body was, and then a voice said, Ya, Chidi, bete kalutala, how tao yo chiwaka tao, kuwande nelaka, lunti chika gito not yona. A burst of giggles followed, and I felt the fear rise in my chest. I felt weak as my body began to shut down. Dee, go sunshine, Ya whispered as he reached out and held me tightly in his arm. My teeth were chattering as I shut my eyes, afraid of everything around me. Ya, I whispered. Kuchipao, he replied back. Kuchipao liao. Who tied na? I pulled away from him. Who tied that shino? He reached into his pocket and took out the phone. It didn't turn on, and my heart dropped. Yo li ya. 找到了。古这罗鸟路红谁不？跟鸟老妈妈个。古这个不听。He nodded and took my hand as we slowly made our way into the hallway where Jay's head lay. A pool of blood had collected, and his eyes were wide open, staring at us without blinking. Ya and I quickly ran around his head and jumped over his body lying in the front of the door. "Tatang," he said. I reached for the light switch, and he grabbed his duffel bag, searching for the charger. When we finally found it, we turned to go when the door slammed shut and locked from the outside. I watched as Jay's headless body suddenly stood up and began walking toward us. Yeah, I'd seen horrifying events before, but never like this where I was the one being tormented. When Jay's body stood up by itself and began limping toward us, I heard Dee's cry and sob beside me as fear jolted inside me. We were locked inside the small room with a dead, headless body that seemed to have come alive. Dee was screaming, and I turned around to grab the small vase on the table. I threw it at Jay's body, and it crumpled down on the floor, his leg in a strange S shape. We both held each other as it got quiet, and then Jay's voice came from outside the door. Yeah, Thao, cái khẩu trong là của na. Yeah, cái khẩu trong là của na ha. Cuối lệnh nhớ nó sự của tôi luôn na. Dee's face broke into horror as she shook her head. Cơ chuyện muna, cơ chuyện sao muna. Then, Jay's voice came louder. Yeah, cái khẩu trong là của na. Chị chú na, mày lo là na, của chị trai na, cái khẩu trong là của na ha. Chú na, chú ta xin nó, cái gì chú kia, tôi là cái tôi đâu mẹ. I cried. And then everything went silent as Dee reached out her hand to lace mine. I let out the breath I'd been holding. The scratching came again from the closet behind us. It was closed tightly, and the scratching came louder and louder. And then May's voice came in a crying tone. Dee, Pakuna, and just as she said this, Jay's voice began calling from the outside. Yeah, Pakuna, Pakuna. The two of us gripped each other tightly, and then the doorknob for the closet began to turn slowly, and a hand with long black fingernails gripped the side of the door, and a head of long black hair peeped out, and May's pale face appeared with a smile. Toi! I woke to the sound of rooster crowing, and I was lying in my bed at home. The smell of my mother's rice cooking filled the air, and I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my chest. Was that a dream? Was that all a dream? I rushed outside and found Jay sitting by the front door, weaving a basket. He looked up at me with a smile and waved. Thao, he asked. This question seemed very familiar, as if he had already asked me that before. And before I could answer, I heard the sound of Dee's laughter, and I turned to find her and May walking toward us, each carrying a basket of corn on their back. Yeah, Jay, cô này tại tụi chơi cả lũ lì bia nó, bé mua sai lũ trẻ nhát rồi đạp ven. Nên ba bé mua xí nhỏ, Dee said. Jay stood up and walked over, a smile on his face. Mua hòn tay mà. Mua lì cơ chi nó mà lì trả lòng. Nên đam mê mùe thế đi tao luôn á. I rubbed my eyes. This was repeating from my dream. It was repeating, and I found myself saying, "Để có sự khai để có mấy thứ nụm bảo đi còn á lóng." Dee smiled and jabbed a finger at my shoulder. Oh, vì nếu chị nói cho nên, thế chị ta lên ta làm thử. Nếu như giàu sứ chị muốn là chị cho cái cho nữa. Là bé mua xì mua là lưu ok mà nọ. Jay nudged me. Mù ok. I looked at Dee's smiling face and remembered the dream I had. Gucci Kong. Her smile faded, and May's eyes lowered to the ground. Dee stepped forward and grabbed my arm. Ôi cha nó, ý có chị mù chê, Gucci là rẻ. Có chị mù sư thế li ta họ. I ran a hand through my hair and shook my head. Gucci Kong thế à? Giờ nếu mù chê, nếu ở trong sáng mù. I turned and walked back into my house, where I heard Dee's voice complaining. My hands were shaking as I thought about my dream and everything that had happened leading to me waking up. It didn't sit right with me, and after a while, I heard Jay bid the girls goodbye, and then he came inside the house to find me. Thao, ôi dạ cái cho sợ luôn à. Cho rồi có tức tọt tàu đi dạo có mua xì xả. Ôi dạ rồi nó có này cái nó nà. He asked me with a questioning gaze. Chị mua ra chị à? Cô Wing chị không thế à? He shook his head and walked out. I waited until he was out of sight, and then I muttered about going out to my mother as I picked up my bow and arrow. I had just stepped outside when Dee grabbed my arm and yanked me toward her. Mua tay mình ra chị. Thứ cho lưu ta lại thì giờ mua xì của thế liên tông không thấy còn bấy mua xì ok nữa nè. Ôi cha, các chồng ở đi lấy rồi lấy có thế ạ? She asked me angrily. I shoved at her and stepped away. Cô chị bảo có hay có đó chị? Smiling, she replied, "Các chú à, chú ý plea, cô chỉ xua cái luôn chứ mà nè. Xua à, giờ cái lúc chị gì xưa mà, cái lúc chị nào tức sinh cái tụi mình nhỏ là tao bé lúc lì lợ. Giờ có thể cứ chỉ muốn gõ tụi anh trai mùi kệ, như chị tao là ok. Từ cái lúc mình chú nhỉ lo ai pin có bé hậu đây cho kịp với nhiều ok nọ. Cha nó cũng muốn mình nhỏ là sẽ có dụ đi cha nó. I felt my hands shaking. This was worse than my nightmare. I turned to her and I frowned. Dee. Khai của sao? Thảo chọn cái mùa xì. Giờ lâu từ mù. Ta xì, ở tụi trọc á là sức bây giờ. She smiled and ran a hand down my cheek. Có những bóng rồng hai tia, giờ đi cả tia. Cả bao. Cũng thiệt tao mê phong tao nửa mới rải kia. Nửa sâu sâu có lúc bên gần gạo sư. Cũng chừng chỉ tao hai tia từ bắt đá đỡ giống một ít lúc xe là chân con ở của mù ná. Phải đã được cái năng lý nữa nà. Cũng như chỉ sư đâu nữa ít xin năng lý. Giờ có chị ô lý của hải, chị ta kỳ. Cũng là thơ kia có bể chế sẽ có ô lý chả nà. She smiled and walked off as I thought about everything going on around me. The dream. It wasn't at all a dream but a premonition. I had been sleeping with Dee for more than a year now, and we had been careful, but I knew mistakes could happen. Somewhere between drinking the water of the oath and the following year, Dee and I developed feelings for each other. I couldn't control myself, and neither could she. If I went with her to the place, I knew it would end up just like my dream. Thao! I turned around to the sound of Dee's voice, and he came to me with a grin on his face. Chả cần cho một đá ta lên à, chỉ có bỏ đá lọ. Chị à, nhiều xe sao? Một đá chỉ nhiều xe thì khai cô, sunshine mà. Suddenly, the betrayal I felt hit me like a ton of bricks. How could I do this to a friend who had been with me from day one? How could I think such evil thoughts? Jay, giờ mua anh thư có bảo tế tôi nâng đa con nó có dụ đi cả, I asked. He frowned and a grin appeared. Ôi chà, nông tế giả xấu luôn à? Có mua tấm mừng đã chi tiết à? I shook my head. Cô sáng tao thâu là sao à? Giờ li, làm bác khổng ta kì đi tìm mình có tư yếu tôn hợp ấy mũ xì. Có hai li ta xì cô sai số, có tư chỉ mua đã chi mũ thế là sáng ló. Perhaps this was my chance to redeem myself. If I went, and I stopped this from happening, I would be able to be a good person. I could prevent Dee from this. I nodded. Oli, là muốn bà? Jay? The house was filled with warmth as Ty let us select a room. I bunked up with Ya, and the two girls shared one room, while Ty opted to sleep alone upstairs. The house was beautiful, on top of a mountain, and the air was breezy and fresh. Ty had begun to barbecue some meat on the grill as the two girls were cutting up fruits in the kitchen. Ya seemed distracted, and I noticed that he was still a little quiet since the awkwardness from last night. He hadn't spoken much, and he remained distant from us. I tried to pry his thoughts, but got nowhere. It wasn't like him to act this way, and I was beginning to worry as the night turned darker. We had dinner, and then Ty took out his guitar and began to sing a song he dedicated to May. That was when Ya and Dee took a walk behind the house. I felt like a third wheel as I sat there with Tai singing and May lost in love. I decided to go inside the house and left the two of them by the fire. I entered the room I shared with Ya and began to dig through the duffel bag I had packed to change clothes for the night. I heard what sounded like voices arguing, and then everything went quiet. As I pulled on a shirt, I heard the door open from the living room and Ya walked in alone. He came into the room we were sharing and sat down on the couch with his eyes darkening and his hands shaking. Tao, có bố chả na? I asked. Without looking at me, he replied, Chiu cha. Cha tao bên hú nó có chỉ rong li có tụ khen. Nhớ uli cha tia. Tôi tới chờ rong có tâm bảo li nó na. Cha cũng sai rong có li có lu xia ni nhớ ni khó li. He finally looked up and gave me a sneer. Cô chỉ muốn chỉ sơ mà. Sao nó nung cũng mà. He got up and left the room as I stared after him. I heard Dee's voice in the house, and then the two of them argued some more. I walked out to find Dee's eyes red with tears. Chuma, nena, I said. That was when I noticed that Tai and May were both gone from the fire outside. Oh, Tai te men go to law. Ya looked where I was gazing at. May she to law jane law? She pala lai. Then footsteps were heard coming down the stairs, and Tai came down with wet hair and a towel around his shoulder. He had a strange smile on his face as he looked from one to the other. Dee stepped forward and asked, May do la? May te la onde gula ne? I stepped away from him and toward Ya and Dee, and the two of them gave me a strange glare. And then Tai looked up at us and stretched his body. Oh,กูชักกอลีนี่ปงเก่งแท้ปตากูจีตัวยังไงก็เกอนี่ตัวน้อกูมั่งกาลอดหัวน้อเลยนี่ชาเชนี่เป็นยังไง He rounded the corner into the kitchen and pulled from the fridge what looked like steak. He brought it to us, and I noticed that it was cooked rare, blood still leaking from the flesh. Shama, he offered it to us. Sha sheni pusi. Gucci no, Dee said. He picked one up and handed it to me. Je. No, ma. I refused, and he laughed. Gotchi no, ye haka shai chita gutu what you je. Je. No, kia ma, Ya said. I took the meat from Tai's hand and I put it inside my mouth, chewing it as I felt the flesh tear apart from the sharpness of my teeth. Bokatia? Tai asked. I only nodded, and then he set down the plate and he looked up at me with an odd grin. Gasha metala. Gopasini yangai. As he said this, I gagged and threw up what I had in my mouth as Ya picked up the plate and tossed it at Tai's face. It clattered to the ground as I tried to get the taste out of my mouth. I asked. He smiled. And then he smiled and turned his attention to Dee. He extended a hand and smiled as she took his hand and walked over to where he was standing. Both Ya and I exchanged looks as Dee turned around and ran a hand down Tai's arm. Ya said. Dee smiled and she sneered at us. Shepe. Linh tư ya tu shepe. Con ra cụ bư ya linh công đâu ta chỉ có cha lù cho mẹ tia. Có bà lý yo nữ. Boy yo. I turned to find Ya's cheeks blushing. Bé ba da na. Tư cha lù ta là hai tia chi bú shi thả linh công đâu. Ta chỉ có chữ chỉ tao có tu khen. Cái là đánh cũng mới có tu mi nhỏ. Cái chỉ muốn đánh mẹ còn nữ mua thia. Thảo cơ. Cái chỉ là ý tu lý kể. Ye cũng mua tu chuột chơi tao mua kia. I shook my head in disgust hearing this, and I turned to Ya, and I found his eyes gazing with tears. How could we be like this? We had made a pact, an oath, to never be romantically involved. My hand flew to my gut, and I felt sick. Dee smiled, and then she took Tai's hand. Cô hai đứa này bảo hay tia? Bé một tờ tua sư, bé chỉ một tờ trọ nằm hả? Mà nó, mấy hạt tụi mù anh tê. Nếu là cá chê, cô mà đi sau cả ta. Ý tụi tôi là, sẽ đợi sự tua cả ta ok. Thảo bí bé tích cho lù rong chua khó. Lần tư xú ở bùa. Lần tư tụi xú tua. Có muốn mê rau thái tua giả có chị khu xử đi đó? I asked. Chị khu xử kia. Nì giờ ý nè bỏ sinh. Chị mua lần tư khởi, khu xử ở đó chị nọ. Nì trở là danh nhau là cô thế. Kia nè có mua tên tì rong đua. And that was when Ya growled loudly beside me. and tossed the vase toward them. Tai ducked, and it crashed into the ground into tiny pieces. I took that moment, grabbing Tai by the throat, and smashed him against the wall. I could hear May's pleading voice as she begged him not to cut her into pieces. It angered me, and I smashed my fist into his face, ruining his perfect smile and bruised his handsome look. Dee's voice yelled at me to stop, and when she came to me, I shoved her off. Tai laughed at me through bloody teeth. Dee, and I smashed his head into the wall where I heard the crack of his skull. When I turned around, Dee stood up from where she had fallen over as Ya came forward. We watched as Dee's face turned pale, and then blood began running down her legs. Her hands came to her belly, and she let out a blood-curdling scream as she bent over. "Pakwa!" she cried. I stepped forward, and Ya stopped me. "Chuyện phá được kia, ít tôi xếp hệ đi nữa. Kia cả tụi nhỏ nữa bắt tôn ra nữa." I was shocked to hear of this, and I watched as Dee screamed, and what looked like a massive glob of tissue came out from her. She fell over, blood pooling from between her legs, and I began to step away. "Bé chỉ nhỏ nâng lợ," Ya said as he came to stand beside me. "Cô yêu tôi sao? Cô yêu tôi biết được chuyện gì chứ cô yêu tôi sao? Có ai đấy chỉ đi con à? Có yêu ô cha bảo hạt tiền lúc xưa yêu cho tôi rong đi cả." He looked at me with sad eyes. "Ya, yêu cái tí bắt đầu yêu lo na, chỉ sao đi na, mua ra chỉ mà đi hay na." He shook his head and then he reached out to take my hand. "Có sao tôi chỉ được cô mà phong yêu? Có chỉ sao xưa cả tư, có mà cho cô mua hạt lâu. Ta xin hôn nào, bé chỉ mua tao trong một trái lọ." Frowning, I asked, "Có hay lý có, sai tao lý cả?" And I felt the knife enter the bottom of my belly, slicing through my intestines, and I coughed up blood. I gasped as Ya pulled me to hug. "Phong yêu, kế kia lù, yêu chủ nhớ trộn khó. Cứ rong xưa tiệt tiệt nó, của tao cậu của tụi phong yêu. Kia ok, tôi ok." And he pulled out the knife from me and stabbed me again and again, the pain exploding around my body. A smile appeared on his face as he took the knife, and before I blacked out, saw him walk toward Dee. Mà nào bé sao sự hỗ trợ KMTV trong năng của bé mua lừa pha cho này cái gì nhớ rồi bé chế sẽ có tấm mừng con rõ hẹn thầu trâu đánh trong tôi mà nào dân nu chỉ tôi tính năng tàu tua nhà trong đi tôi xa tôi tua hậu lúc chế đợt chỉ tôi năng nọ hoa tài bỏ hử xa cử tôi tú thái giờ ít tôi trâu tua tại chỉ nào tôi chẳng sự chớ tôi hay tiệt giờ tôi xa tôi sẽ đợi tôi xứ đom luôn gì mua sẽ giật đây nào bấm mua lừa pha chia tới tôi cứ giờ ba những sự kiện từ KMTV trong năng của bé. Thank you for tuning in to The Oath. I will see you in the next episode.
오늘의 날씨 일기예보는 맑음 햇살 밝은 오후 무작정 어딘가 향하는 발걸음 너와 자주 걷던 거리 어쩌면 너무 익숙해져 버린 습관과 같던 매일 너랑 기억에 갇혀 살아 사랑을 받았었던 추억들이 피어오르네 그림자 없이 날 비추는 태양 그 아래 우산 없이 그냥 흠뻑 도잡고 있어 Rain Yeah 하염없이 비가 내려 두 뺨 위로 이렇게 맑은데 차라리 빗물이라고 불러대면 마음 편할 텐데 있을까 잊을 수 있을까 지울 수 있을까 잊을 수 있을까 지울 수 있을까 잊을 수 있을까 지울 수 있을까 네 날씨 일기예보는 맑음 햇살 발